The concert hall in Vienna was one of the most beautiful places in the world. Its walls were painted gold. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Red velvet seats stretched out in perfect rows, waiting for audiences who paid hundreds of dollars just to sit in them. Famous musicians from every corner of the earth dreamed of performing on its stage. It was a place of magic, of talent, of dreams coming true. But for Adelina Ruiz, it was just a place she cleaned every night. She was 62 years old. Her hair had turned gray a long time ago, and she kept it tied back in a simple bun. Her hands were rough from years of work. Her back ached most days, especially in winter when the cold crept into her bones. She wore the same faded blue uniform every shift, a uniform that made her invisible to everyone who walked past her. And people did walk past her. Every single day. The musicians never looked at her. The managers never spoke to her unless something was wrong. The audience members who stayed late after shows stepped around her mop like she was a piece of furniture. To them, she was nobody. Just the cleaning lady. Just another worker doing a job that nobody wanted to think about. Adelina had accepted this a long time ago. She had taught herself not to feel the sting of being ignored. She had learned to keep her head down, do her work, and go home to her small apartment where she lived alone with her memories. But what nobody knew, what nobody could ever guess, was that Adelina Ruiz had once been somebody very different. 40 years ago. On an island thousands of miles away, a young girl named Adelina had sat at a piano for the first time. She was only 5 years old. Her fingers were tiny, barely able to reach the keys. But when she pressed down and heard the sound that came out, something inside her woke up. It was like finding a voice she never knew she had. Her mother noticed right away. She saved every penny she could and found a teacher who agreed to give lessons for almost nothing. The teacher was an old man who had once played in the great concert halls of Europe before the revolution changed everything. He saw something special in Adelina. He saw a gift. By the time she was 10, Adelina could play pieces that grown musicians struggled with. By 15, she was being called a prodigy. People in her country whispered about her. They said she had magic in her fingers. They said she would be famous one day. They said she would show the world what their small island could produce. Adelina practiced 8 hours a day, sometimes more. Her fingers bled, and she kept playing. Her back screamed in pain, and she kept playing. She missed birthday parties and school dances and all the normal things girls her age did. But she did not care. The piano was her life. The piano was her everything. At 22, she received the news she had been waiting for her entire life. She had been selected to represent her country at an international piano competition in Europe. It was the chance of a lifetime. If she won or even placed, doors would open for her. She could travel. She could perform. She could share her music with the world. She practiced for 6 months straight. She chose to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most difficult and emotional pieces ever written. It was a piece about longing, about loss, about hope that refuses to die. When Adelina played it, people cried. Even her strict old teacher wiped tears from his eyes. 2 weeks before she was supposed to leave, the government came for her father. He was a professor, a quiet man who loved books and ideas. He had said some things in his classroom that the wrong people heard. That was all it took. They came in the middle of the night and took him away. Adelina never saw him again. After that, everything fell apart. The government decided that Adelina's family was dangerous. They were labeled as enemies. Her mother was fired from her job. Their neighbors stopped speaking to them. And Adelina's invitation to the competition was taken away. Just like that. Everything she had worked for her entire life was gone. Her teacher tried to help. He wrote letters. He begged officials, but it was no use. The decision had been made. Adelina Ruiz would not be allowed to leave the country. She would not perform. She would not share her gift with the world. For 3 years, Adelina tried to keep playing, but every time she sat at the piano, she thought of her father. She thought of the competition she would never attend. She thought of the life that had been stolen from her. The music that once brought her joy now brought only pain. One night, she closed the lid of her piano and never opened it again. A few years later, when she was 28, she found a way to escape. It was dangerous. It cost her everything she had. She left her mother behind, knowing she might never see her again. She crossed oceans and borders and ended up in Europe, a refugee with nothing but the clothes on her back and a broken heart. She could not prove her education. She could not prove her training. She had no papers, no certificates, no recordings of her performances. To the world, she was just another immigrant looking for work. So she took the only job she could find. She cleaned offices. She scrubbed toilets. She mopped floors. And eventually, she ended up in Vienna, in the most beautiful concert hall in the world, cleaning up after the musicians who lived the life she had once dreamed of. 30-4 years. That is how long Adelina had worked there. 34 years of pushing a mop across marble floors. 34 years of watching famous pianists walk past her without a glance. 34 years of hearing music fill the hall while she stood in the shadows, invisible. Every night, after her shift ended and the hall was empty, Adelina would walk slowly to the stage. She would stand in front of the grand piano, a Steinway, worth more than she would earn in 10 lifetimes, and she would just look at it. Sometimes she reached out and touched the polished black wood. Sometimes she ran her fingers along the edge of the closed lid, but she never opened it. She never played. She was afraid. Not of being caught. Not of getting in trouble. She was afraid of remembering. She was afraid that if she touched those keys, all the pain she had buried for so long would come flooding back. She was afraid that the music would remind her of everything she had lost, her father, her mother, her country, her dreams. So she just stood there, night after night, year after year, a ghost haunting the place where her dreams had died. The other workers knew nothing about her past. To them, she was just quiet old Adelina, who never complained and always finished her work on time. They did not know that the woman mopping the floor had once been called a genius. They did not know that her hands, now cracked and worn, had once made people weep with their beauty. Nobody knew, and Adelina believed nobody ever would. She had made peace with that. She would finish her years working in this hall, retire to her small apartment, and die with her secret locked inside her. The world would never hear her play. The music inside her would stay silent forever. At least, that is what she believed. Until one ordinary evening when everything changed. It was a Thursday evening in late November. The weather outside was cold and gray, the kind of cold that made your bones ache. Adelina arrived at the concert hall at her usual time, 5 o'clock in the evening, ready for another long night of cleaning. There was a big performance scheduled for the following night. A world-famous pianist was coming to play. His name was on posters all over the city. His face was on the cover of magazines. He was the kind of musician who sold out concert halls months in advance. People flew in from other countries just to hear him play. Critics called him a genius. They said he was the greatest pianist of his generation. Adelina had seen many famous musicians come and go over the years. She had cleaned up after legends. She had emptied trash cans filled with flowers that adoring fans had thrown onto the stage. None of it impressed her anymore. To her, they were just people who made messes that she had to clean. That evening, the hall was supposed to be empty. The big rehearsal was not scheduled until the next morning. Adelina expected to have the place to herself, the way she liked it. She could work in peace, move at her own pace, and spend a few quiet moments near the piano before going home. But when she walked into the main auditorium, she saw that she was not alone. A man was on the stage, standing near the grand piano. He looked to be in his early 40s. He wore an expensive black coat and a silk scarf wrapped around his neck. His dark hair was slicked back perfectly. Everything about him screamed money and success. He was talking loudly on his phone, pacing back and forth, his voice echoing through the empty hall. Adelina recognized him immediately. It was the famous pianist, the one everyone was talking about, the one whose concert had been sold out for months. She lowered her head and tried to stay invisible, the way she always did. She grabbed her cleaning cart and pushed it quietly toward the far side of the hall, hoping he would not notice her. She had learned a long time ago that the best way to survive in places like this was to never be seen and never be heard. But tonight, fate had other plans. The man ended his phone call and looked around the empty hall. His eyes scanned the seats, the walls, the ceiling. He seemed restless, like he was waiting for something. Then his gaze landed on Adelina. She froze. For a moment, he just stared at her. She could feel his eyes taking in her faded uniform, her gray hair, her mop and bucket. She knew what he was seeing. An old cleaning lady. Nobody important. Nobody worth his time. But instead of looking away, he smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that people give when they are about to amuse themselves at someone else's expense. He waved her over. Adelina's heart began to beat faster. She did not want to go. She wanted to disappear into the shadows and pretend she had not seen him. But he was waving again, more insistently this time. She had no choice. She left her cart and walked slowly toward the stage. Her footsteps echoed in the silence. The closer she got, the more nervous she felt. She had not spoken to a performer in years. She did not know what he could possibly want from her. When she reached the edge of the stage, he looked down at her with that same amused smile. "You work here?" he asked. His accent was refined, polished, the accent of someone who had grown up with everything. Adelina nodded. "Yes, sir. I clean the hall." "How long?" 34 years. His eyebrows rose slightly. 34 years? My goodness. You must know this place better than anyone. Adelina said nothing. She did not know where this conversation was going, and that made her uncomfortable. The man turned and looked at the grand piano behind him. It sat there like a sleeping giant, its black surface gleaming under the stage lights. He walked over to it and lifted the lid, revealing the pristine white and black keys underneath. "I arrived early to check the acoustics," he said, almost to himself. "My sound engineer is running late." Very annoying. Adelina still did not speak. She just stood there, waiting to be dismissed so she could go back to her work. But the man was not done with her. He turned back to face her, and that amused smile returned to his lips. "Tell me," he said, "can you play the piano?" The question hit Adelina like a punch to the chest. For a moment, she could not breathe. Her mind went blank. Her hands, which had been hanging at her sides, began to tremble. I don't," she stammered. "Oh, come on," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Everyone knows something. A little nursery rhyme, perhaps. Twinkle, twinkle, little star? Something simple?" He was making fun of her. She could hear it in his voice. He was bored, waiting for his engineer, and he had decided to entertain himself with the old cleaning lady. He expected her to blush and shake her head and scurry away. That would give him a little laugh, a little story to tell his friends later. The cleaning woman who could not play a single note. Adelina knew she should just say no. She should apologize and go back to her mop and her bucket and her invisible life. That was the safe thing to do. That was what she had done for 34 years. But something inside her was breaking. Maybe it was the way he looked at her, like she was nothing. Maybe it was the arrogance in his voice, the assumption that someone like her could not possibly know anything about music. Maybe it was 34 years of being ignored, of being invisible, of standing in front of that piano every night and never having the courage to play. Or maybe it was something deeper. Maybe it was the memory of her father, who had believed in her until the day he was taken away. Maybe it was the memory of her old teacher, who had told her she had a gift that the world needed to hear. Maybe it was the memory of the young girl she used to be, the one who had practiced until her fingers bled because she loved the piano more than anything in the world. Whatever it was, something inside Adelina snapped. She looked up at the famous pianist. She looked at his expensive coat and his silk scarf and his perfect hair. She looked at the arrogance in his eyes. And for the first time in 34 years, she did not look away. "May I?" she asked quietly, gesturing toward the piano. The man laughed. It was a short, surprised laugh, like he had not expected her to actually accept the challenge. But he stepped aside and gestured toward the bench with a dramatic sweep of his arm. "Please," he said, "be my guest." Adelina walked on to the stage. Her legs felt weak. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The piano seemed to grow larger with every step she took toward it. When she reached the bench, she stopped. She stood there for a long moment, just looking at the keys. They were so white, so clean, so perfect. She had not touched a piano in almost 40 years. She did not even know if she still remembered how to play, but her hands remembered. Before her mind could stop her, she sat down on the bench. She placed her fingers on the keys. They felt cool and smooth under her rough, worn skin. She took a deep breath. The famous pianist stood a few feet away, his arms crossed, an amused smile still on his face. He was expecting "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." He was expecting something clumsy and simple and laughable. He had no idea what was about to happen. Adelina closed her eyes. And in her mind, she was not a 62-year-old cleaning lady anymore. She was 22 again. She was back in her homeland, sitting in a small practice room, preparing for the competition that would change her life. She could hear her teacher's voice telling her to breathe, to feel the music, to let it flow through her like water. She pressed down on the first key, and the sound that came out was not "Twinkle, twinkle, little star." The first notes of Chopin's ballade, No, 1 in G minor, floated into the empty concert hall. It was soft at first, hesitant, like a voice that had not spoken in decades, trying to remember how to form words. Adelina's fingers trembled as they moved across the keys. Her hands felt stiff and unsure. 40 years was a long time. 40 years of silence. 40 years of pretending that this part of her did not exist. But the piano remembered her. And slowly, note by note, she began to remember it too. The famous pianist had been standing with his arms crossed, that smug smile still on his face. He had been expecting something funny, something embarrassing. A cleaning lady stumbling through a children's song. That would have made a good story for his friends at dinner parties. He could already imagine their laughter. But within the first few seconds, his smile began to fade, his arms slowly uncrossed. His body went still. His eyes, which had been looking at Adelina with amusement, now widened with something else entirely. Confusion, disbelief, and then, as the music continued to build, something that looked almost like fear, because what he was hearing was not possible. Cleaning ladies did not play like this. Old women in faded uniforms did not play like this. This was not the clumsy fumbling of an amateur. This was not someone who had taken a few lessons as a child and remembered a simple tune. This was something else entirely. This was mastery. This was genius. This was the kind of playing that took a lifetime to develop, and it was coming from a woman who mopped floors for a living. Adelina did not see his reaction. Her eyes were closed. She had gone somewhere else entirely. She was no longer in the concert hall in Vienna. She was back home, in the small practice room where she had spent her youth. She could smell the tropical air coming through the open window. She could hear the sound of birds outside. She could feel her old teacher standing behind her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as she played. The ballade was coming back to her. Every phrase, every dynamic, every tiny detail that she had practiced thousands of times. Her fingers knew where to go, even when her mind could not keep up. Muscle memory is a strange thing. It lives in the body long after the brain has forgotten. And Adelina's body had never forgotten. The piece began to grow in intensity. The soft, questioning opening gave way to something more powerful. The melody rose and fell like waves crashing against rocks. There were moments of heartbreaking tenderness, followed by passages of fierce, almost violent emotion. Chopin had written this piece about longing and loss. He had written it about a home he could never return to. He had written it about dreams that had been stolen by forces beyond his control. Adelina understood every note. Because she had lived it as she played, the music began to fill her with something she had not felt in 40 years. At first, she did not recognize it. It was warm and bright and terrifying all at once. It spread through her chest and into her arms and down to her fingertips. And then she realized what it was. It was joy. Pure, overwhelming joy. The joy of doing the thing she was born to do. The joy of finally letting go of the fear that had kept her silent for so long. The joy of being herself again, after decades of hiding. But the joy was mixed with something else, something darker and heavier. As the music swelled, so did the memories. She thought of her father, gentle and kind, who had encouraged her from the very beginning. She thought of the night they took him away, how he had looked back at her one last time before disappearing into the darkness. She thought of her mother, left behind on the island, growing old alone. She thought of the competition she never got to attend, the career she never got to have. The life that had been ripped away from her. Tears began to stream down her face. She did not try to stop them. She could not have stopped them, even if she wanted to. They fell onto the keys, mixing with the music, becoming part of it. The famous pianist had not moved. He stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, his eyes fixed on the old woman at the piano. He had performed on stages all over the world. He had heard the greatest musicians of his generation. He had won awards and received standing ovations and been called a genius more times than he could count. But he had never heard anything like this. It was not just the technical skill, though that was extraordinary. It was something deeper, something raw and honest and painfully human. This woman was not just playing notes on a piano. She was pouring her entire life into the music. Every loss, every heartbreak, every moment of despair, it was all there, flowing out through her fingers and into the air. He felt a lump forming in his throat. His eyes, which had been dry and amused just minutes ago, began to sting. He blinked rapidly, trying to hold back what he was feeling. But it was no use. A single tear escaped and rolled down his cheek. He quickly wiped it away, embarrassed. He was a professional. He did not cry at performances. But this was different. This was not a performance. This was something sacred, something private. He felt like he was witnessing a miracle, and he did not know what to do with that feeling. The ballade moved into its final section. The music grew faster, more urgent, more desperate. Adelina's hands flew across the keys with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for someone who had not played in 40 years. But she was not thinking about her hands anymore. She was not thinking about anything. She had become the music. There was no separation between her and the piano. They were one. The final chords approached. They were massive, thundering, filled with a kind of tragic triumph. Adelina played them with every ounce of strength she had left. The sound filled the concert hall, bouncing off the golden walls, rising up to the crystal chandeliers, echoing into every corner and shadow. And then, silence. Adelina's hands remained on the keys for a long moment. She was breathing hard. Her whole body was shaking. The tears were still falling, but she did not care. She felt empty and full at the same time. Broken and healed. Dead and reborn. She had done it. After 40 years, she had finally played again. Slowly, she opened her eyes. The concert hall came back into focus. The golden walls, the velvet seats, the chandeliers glittering above, and standing just a few feet away, the famous pianist, staring at her with an expression she could not read. She expected him to be angry. She expected him to be confused. She expected him to demand to know who she was and how she had learned to play like that. She was ready for questions, accusations, suspicion, but what she saw in his eyes was none of those things. What she saw was awe. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He tried again, and still nothing. The great pianist, who had given hundreds of interviews and spoken to audiences around the world, could not find a single thing to say. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he took a step toward her. Then another. He walked slowly, almost reverently, until he was standing right beside the piano bench. He looked down at Adelina, at her tear-streaked face and trembling hands and faded blue uniform. And then he did something that surprised them both. He dropped to one knee, lowered his head, and began to weep. Neither of them noticed that they were no longer alone. Neither of them saw the faces appearing in the doorways around the hall. Neither of them heard the footsteps of people drawn from the corridors and backstage rooms by the sound of music that was too beautiful to ignore. A crowd was gathering in the shadows, and Adelina's secret was about to be revealed to the world. The first person to hear the music was a young security guard named Raphael. He was 23 years old, working the night shift to pay his way through university. He had been sitting at his desk near the back entrance, scrolling through his phone, bored out of his mind. Then something strange happened. He heard a sound coming from the main hall, a sound that made him put down his phone and listen. At first, he thought it must be a recording. Maybe someone was testing the speakers for tomorrow's concert. But as he listened more closely, he realized it was too raw, too alive to be a recording. Someone was actually playing, and they were playing like nothing he had ever heard before. He got up from his desk and walked toward the sound. The second person to hear it was a woman who worked in the costume department. She was in her 50s, a widow who had taken this job after her husband passed away because she needed something to fill her days. She had been folding programs in a small room backstage when the music reached her. She stopped what she was doing and tilted her head, confused. The hall was supposed to be empty tonight. Who could be playing? She set down the programs and followed the sound. One by one, people throughout the building stopped what they were doing. A lighting technician who had been checking equipment. A janitor who worked on the upper floors. 2 violinists from the city orchestra who had come to pick up some sheet music they had left behind. A caterer who was setting up for a private event the following week. They all heard the same thing. They all felt the same pull. And they all began walking toward the main concert hall. The music was like a magnet. It reached into every corner of the building and drew people out of their hiding places. It did not matter who they were or what they had been doing. The music called to them, and they came back by the time Adelina reached the final chords of the ballad. Nearly 30 people had gathered in the shadows of the auditorium. They stood in the doorways and along the walls, barely breathing, afraid to make a sound. Some of them had tears on their faces. Others stood with their hands over their mouths, overwhelmed by what they were witnessing. Nobody knew who the old woman at the piano was. Nobody understood how a cleaning lady in a faded uniform could play with such power and beauty. But they all knew they were seeing something extraordinary, something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. When the final notes faded into silence, nobody moved. The hall was completely still. Even the air seemed to be holding its breath. Then the famous pianist dropped to his knee and began to weep. That was when Adelina finally looked up. And that was when she saw them. Her heart nearly stopped. There were people everywhere, faces she did not recognize, staring at her from the darkness. Her first instinct was fear. She had been caught. She had touched the piano without permission. She was going to be fired. After 34 years, she was going to lose her job because she could not control herself for one night. She started to stand up, ready to apologize, ready to beg for forgiveness. But before she could say a word, something happened that she never expected. Someone started clapping Dot. It was the young security guard, Raphael. He was standing near the back of the hall, and he was clapping as hard as he could. His hands came together again and again, filling the silence with a sound that echoed off the golden walls. Then the woman from the costume department joined in. Then the lighting technician. Then the janitor. Then the violinists. Then everyone else. Within seconds, the entire hall was filled with applause. It was not polite applause, the kind people give out of obligation. It was thunderous. It was passionate. It was the sound of people who had just witnessed something that moved them to their core. Adelina stood frozen beside the piano bench. She did not know what to do. She did not know how to react. For 40 years, she had dreamed of hearing this sound. She had imagined what it would feel like to stand on a stage and receive the appreciation of an audience. But she had given up on that dream a long time ago. She had accepted that it would never happen. And now here she was, in the most beautiful concert hall in the world, surrounded by strangers who were applauding her like she was the greatest pianist they had ever heard. She started to cry again. But this time, they were different tears. These were not tears of sadness or loss. These were tears of healing. 40 years of pain, 40 years of silence, 40 years of hiding. It was all pouring out of her at once. The famous pianist rose to his feet. His face was still wet with tears, but he was smiling now. It was not the arrogant smile he had worn before. It was something softer, something humbled. He turned to face the small crowd that had gathered, and he raised his hands to quiet them. "Please," he said, his voice shaky with emotion. "Please, you have to understand what we just witnessed. I have performed on stages all over the world. I have studied with the greatest teachers. I have devoted my entire life to this instrument. And I am telling you now, with complete honesty, that what this woman just played was one of the most extraordinary things I have ever heard." He turned back to Adelina, his eyes searching her face. "Who are you?" he asked. "Where did you come from? How is this possible?" Adelina wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She did not know how to answer. She had kept her secret for so long that she did not know how to let it go. But the faces around her were kind. They were curious. They were not judging her or looking down on her. They were looking at her with respect, with admiration, with wonder. So she took a deep breath, and she began to talk. She told them about the island where she was born. She told them about the little girl who fell in love with the piano at age 5. She told them about her teacher, the old man who believed in her when nobody else did. She told them about the years of practice, the bleeding fingers, the sacrifices she made for her dream. And then she told them about the night everything fell apart. The night the government took her father. The night her future was stolen. The night she closed the lid of her piano and swore she would never play again. She told them about escaping, about crossing oceans, about arriving in Europe with nothing. She told them about the decades of cleaning floors and being invisible. She told them about standing in front of this very piano every night, wanting to play but being too afraid that, by the time she finished, there was not a dry eye in the hall. The woman from the costume department was sobbing openly. The young security guard had to lean against the wall for support. Even the famous pianist, who had always prided himself on his composure, was wiping tears from his cheeks. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The weight of Adelina's story hung in the air. Heavy and heartbreaking and beautiful Dot. Then the famous pianist did something that would change everything. He pulled out his phone and held it up. "I hope you do not mind," he said softly, "but I recorded your performance, every second of it. And with your permission, I would like to share it with the world." Adelina stared at him. She did not understand. Share it with the world? What did that mean? She was a cleaning lady. She was nobody. Why would the world care about her? But the look in his eyes told her that something big was about to happen. Something she could not control. Something that would change her life forever. She thought about saying no. She thought about asking him to delete the video and forget this ever happened. She could go back to her mop and her bucket and her invisible life. She could pretend that tonight was just a dream. But then she thought about her father. She thought about what he would want her to do. She thought about the young girl she used to be, the one who had dreamed of sharing her music with the world. Dot. And slowly, with a trembling voice, she said the word that would change everything. Yes. The video was uploaded at 11 o'clock that night. By midnight, it had 10,000 views. By sunrise, it had crossed 1 million. By the end of the following day, it had been watched by over 20 million people around the world. The headline spread across every news website, every social media platform, every television channel. Cleaning lady stuns world famous. Pianist with breathtaking performance. The janitor who played Chopin. Hidden genius. The heartbreaking story behind the viral piano video. Adelina woke up the next morning in her small apartment, completely unaware of what was happening. She made herself a cup of coffee the way she did every morning. She sat by her window and watched the pigeons on the rooftop across the street. She thought about the night before and wondered if it had all been a dream. Then her phone rang. It was the manager of the concert hall. He was speaking so fast that she could barely understand him. Something about a video. Something about millions of views. Something about reporters waiting outside the building. He asked her to come in immediately. Adelina did not own a computer. She did not use social media. She had no idea what he was talking about. But she could hear the urgency in his voice. So she got dressed and took the bus to the concert hall, just like she did every day. When she arrived, she understood. There were news vans parked outside. Cameras everywhere. Reporters with microphones, shouting questions at anyone who walked by. Security guards were trying to hold back a crowd of people who had gathered on the sidewalk. And when Adelina stepped off the bus, someone recognized her. "There she is," a voice shouted. "That's her." Suddenly, everyone was running toward her. Cameras flashed in her face. Microphones were shoved in front of her. People were shouting her name, asking questions in languages she did not understand. She felt like she was drowning. She could not breathe. She did not know what was happening or why. The security guards rushed to her side and helped her get inside the building. But even inside, there was no escape. Staff members who had ignored her for years were now staring at her with wide eyes. Some of them started clapping when she walked past. Others just stood there with their mouths open, unable to believe that the old cleaning lady they had never noticed was suddenly the most famous person in the world. Over the next few days, Adelina's life changed in ways she could never have imagined. She received interview requests from every major news network. Journalists flew in from other countries just to speak with her. Her story was translated into dozens of languages and shared in places she had never even heard of. People who had never met her were writing about her, making videos about her, crying over her story. And the messages. Thousands and thousands of messages poured in from around the world. People who had lost their own dreams and found hope in her story. Refugees who had been forced to leave everything behind. Artists who had given up on their passions. Ordinary people who had felt invisible their whole lives. They all wrote to tell her that her story had touched them, that watching her play had made them believe in second chances, that she had inspired them to pick up their own forgotten dreams and try again. Adelina read as many messages as she could. Each one made her cry. She had spent 40 years believing that her gift was worthless, that her sacrifice had meant nothing, that she had been forgotten by the world. And now the world was telling her that she mattered, that her music mattered, that her story mattered. But the biggest surprise came 2 weeks after the video went viral. She received a letter from the board of directors of the Vienna Concert Hall. They were inviting her to perform, not as a cleaning lady who had accidentally been caught on camera, as a featured artist on the main stage. In front of a sold-out audience, Adelina read the letter 3 times before she believed it was real. She did not know what to say. Part of her wanted to refuse. She was 62 years old. She had not performed professionally in 4 decades. She was terrified of failing, of disappointing all those people who now believed in her. What if the night in the empty hall had been a fluke? What if she could not do it again? But then she remembered something her father had told her a long time ago. They had been sitting together on the porch of their little house, watching the sunset. She had been nervous about an upcoming recital, afraid that she would make a mistake. And her father had taken her hand and said, "The music does not belong to you, my dear. It belongs to everyone. Your job is just to set it free." She had carried those words with her for 40 years. And now, finally, she understood what they meant. She wrote back to the board of directors. She accepted the invitation. The night of the concert arrived faster than she expected. Adelina stood backstage, wearing a simple black dress that someone had bought for her. Her hair was still gray, still tied back in the same simple bun. Her hands were still rough and worn from years of work. She looked nothing like the glamorous performers who usually graced this stage. But when she peeked through the curtain and saw the audience, her heart nearly burst. Every seat was filled. People had come from all over the world to see her. She recognized some faces from the video. The young security guard was there, sitting in the front row with his mother. The woman from the costume department was there too, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief before the performance had even started. And somewhere in the crowd, she knew, there were strangers who had seen her video and traveled thousands of miles just to be here tonight. A stagehand touched her shoulder. It was time. Adelina walked onto the stage. The lights were blinding. The applause was deafening. She had to stop for a moment just to take it all in. 62 years old. A cleaning lady. An immigrant. A woman who had been invisible for most of her life. And here she was, standing on the most prestigious stage in the world, being applauded by thousands of people who had come to hear her play. She sat down at the piano. The same Steinway she had touched that night. The same keys that had awakened her after 40 years of sleep The hall fell silent. Every eye was on her. Every heart was waiting. Adelina placed her fingers on the keys. She took a deep breath, and then she began to play. The music that filled the hall that night was different from the video. It was not filled with pain and loss and sorrow. It was filled with gratitude, with joy, with hope. Adelina played not as a woman mourning what she had lost, but as a woman celebrating what she had found. She played for her father, who had believed in her until the end. She played for her mother, who was watching on a television screen thousands of miles away. She played for every person who had ever been told they were not good enough, not important enough, not worthy of their dreams. And when she finished, when the last note faded into the silence of the hall, something happened that had never happened before in that concert. Hall's long and famous history. Every single person rose to their feet at the same moment. The applause was like thunder. It shook the walls. It rattled the chandeliers. It went on and on and on, wave after wave of love and admiration crashing over the old woman at the piano. Adelina stood up slowly. Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. For the first time in 40 years, she was truly, completely, deeply happy. She had waited her whole life for this moment. She had suffered and sacrificed and lost almost everything, but she had never given up. And now, at 62 years old, she was finally living the dream that had been stolen from her so long ago. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces full of tears and joy, at the standing ovation that showed no signs of stopping. And she whispered 2 words that only she could hear. "Thank you, Papa." Then she placed her hand over her heart, bowed deeply, and let the love of the world wash over her dot. The cleaning lady had become a legend, and her music would never be silent again.